Welcome, everybody. Quite happy to see that so many of you made it to a talk that has the word customer in the title. My name is Toby. I'm working under the brand name Tech Unicorn Builders together with my business partner. I have a software engineering background. I also do infrastructure engineering. I do a lot of things like technical leadership and basically all kinds of things, sometimes front-end if I have to. By now, I'm mostly consulting startups and scale-ups on their journey to build better software products faster. And because we are mostly working with software as a service companies, continuous deployments are kind of crucial. So, before we start, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Who of you is deploying at least once a month? Raise your hands. Most, that sounds good. Keep your hands open. Once a week? A bit less, okay. How about once a day? Okay. And continuously? Anybody? Oh, nice. Okay, continuously, like really, like even Fridays? Nice. Okay, great. Because like continuous, right, means without pause or interruption. So it means like the pipeline checks properties about the artifact you are about to deliver. The time or the moon phase or the day of the week is not a property of your artifact, hopefully. So for those of you who didn't raise their hand for continuous deployments, just imagine this. How would it feel like if your changes are live within minutes? Probably a bit like this, right? But with more teeth. If you do multi-deployment migrations, like for example, you are renaming a database table, let's say, or you change an API that you're only using internally, how would that look like? Like you need probably 2 to 3 deployments for that, like you need to rename a table, and you want to do this zero downtime deployment, like what are you doing? You introduce a view, you use that view points, it's a simple view, for example in Postgres, pointing to your old database table, and you deploy that. Then as soon as everything is deployed and everything is using that view, you rename the table and you can drop the view. And as soon as that is done, yeah, you can drop the view and you are done. So you need at least 2 deployments in order to make this safe, maybe even 3 depending of the order of things. So if you can deploy your artifacts, your services within minutes, that's going to look like this. And if it looks like this, you are far more likely to do it. Because if you only deploy once a week, it takes you already 2 weeks to get this done. If you do deployments continuously, like 20 times a day, maybe if you have to, it's like this, super fast. That's why we need continuous deployments, because they allow us to move faster. And this also allows us, and by the way, when I'm talking about continuous deployments, I'm talking about deployments to production, to a live system where customers can use it. I'm not talking about staging deployments. This is like playing around with ourselves. It's not bringing really value to customers. I mean deployments to production. And if you deploy to production more often and faster, you get also feedback much earlier, right? You get feedback, hey, something doesn't work in production, very great, we can fix it. Or you can try an experiment, you get feedback from customers, you might get metrics, something like this within minutes, maybe at least less than an hour, I would say. And that brings you closer to your customers, if you like it or not. And if you're closer to your customers, enables you to build better products faster, and that's what makes you more successful. And it also makes more fun because you know you have an impact with your work. And an important thing, because like, who of you are developers? Okay, how much do you like deployments? Okay. It makes deployments a non-event because you're doing it all the time. There is no need to get excited about it. At least you shouldn't. And it's just something that happens. It's a bit like breathing, you know? We breathe all the time. We don't think about it. And it's nothing special. We probably love doing it. If we think about it, it's great that we breathe, because if we don't breathe, we stop existing. So we should love deployments. right? Love deployments because they actually bring your work in front of the customers, right? They only show you if it's really working in production because let's face it, your staging environment is not production. Like, even if you have the same configuration, you usually have less data, you have less traffic, and maybe then you have some configuration mismatches as well. And that's something breaks you only see in production. So with deployments, you bring things to production, and that allows you to do a lot of great things. So, but you should hate spending time on them, because continuous zero downtime deployments, fully automatic, that's a problem that have several people solved a long time ago. And like a lot of companies are working like that. So it's something that machines can do for us. So why should we spend time on them? I mean, as developers, we should hate wasting our time, right? So, and like, that's basically waste if you need to do it manually. In this session, I want to take you on a story, a real journey that I underwent with the startup back then, a couple of years ago. Took also a while, like over a year. And that was a B2B SaaS startup from Germany. They turned into like some kind of hyper-growth scale-up, which made this journey a lot more interesting. And in the beginning, like when I joined, it was probably around 5 to 6 teams. That over 1 year grew to 15 teams. And those 15 teams worked on 2 services. And those, like there were a couple of more, but 2 main services. So it was a bit of a monolithic thing. Those services were deployed to Kubernetes in AWS, EKS basically. And they had around 9-ish front ends. Vue.js, by the way. But those were deployed to S3 buckets and then via AWS CloudFront, content delivery network, delivered to end users. So that was kind of the setup. We had GitLab pipelines, and there existed already some pipelines that did some unit testing, that did some building, pushing Docker containers to some registry. And even there was a manual job that could be triggered to deploy things to a production environment. We also had staging environments and these kind of things. Deployments happened twice a week because it was manual, and also in order to be confident about what we were building, some things needed to happen that were not part of the pipeline. Like end-to-end testing, for example. There were some semi-automated end-to-end tests, Selenium at that time, that were owned by the QA team. We had a QA team of 3 people for like up to 60 developers in the end that were kind of trying to keep up with everything. So before every deployment on Tuesday and Thursday, they were doing the end-to-end test. And then they realized, okay, something doesn't work. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that in a second. But those end-to-end tests, they were also quite flaky. They were quite slow. And also not all of the end-to-end tests were fully automated. So, and nobody knew what exactly it was. So, and the deployments happened twice a week. Guess who did the deployments? Any guesses? The QA team. Not necessarily because they knew really how to do that, or like it makes sense that they did it, but they were kind of the last team in the pipeline. Like we had the dev teams, they were like integrating changes to the main branch, and then the QA team 2 times a week would go there, take what's there, test it on the staging system, and then when they said, yeah, it looks good, they deployed it using the jobs that were already there, but still it was kind of their responsibility. And when something broke, they kind of panicked and like tried to find the dev team that could help them to fix it. That was a bit my reaction when I joined the company. Like, I mean, they were cool. I joined them because there were a lot of cool people working. They were a new startup. They did a lot of things right. And I thought, well, sure, continuous deployments. I didn't even ask because I thought, of course, they have solved that. And I joined and I thought, okay, well, it's not like that. I was a bit surprised. But, well, okay, up for the challenge. And I thought, okay, let's bring the developers closer to the deployments. And that was their reaction, kind of. No, please don't. Like, we have the QA team. It's nice. Like, we just integrate into the main branch and then, well, sometimes it's messy, but it's also comfortable. And the deployment process often in practice looked like this, because this is exactly what you get when you do it like we did it. Because mistake number one, like testing before deployment, don't do that. Do it after integrating into the main branch. When you do continuous deployments, that's basically the same thing, but otherwise, between integrating to the main branch and testing, there might easily lay 2 days, for example. So you get the feedback that your changes that you integrated broke something after 2 days. So do it after integrating into the main branch, and do that frequently, of course. Also, the engineering teams did not really know what's like a breaking change, or like sometimes they did changes and thought, okay, it will be fine because it's part of the same deployment, like changing a front end and a back end at the same time, without considering that at some point there might still be an old version of one of the backend living and answering requests while still a new front end tries to use the new API. So this kind of knowledge, that's like, I would say basic knowledge at that point, was kind of missing. So also we didn't have like proper systems like feature toggles, for example, to deactivate changes very quickly if you saw something went wrong. So a lot of things were missing here. And the QA team usually needed like half a day, sometimes even a day, to fix something, to deploy something, because then they found, okay, it doesn't work. They need to figure out, is it the tests or is it the production system? All of that. So it was like this. At the same time, the deployment process was very solidified because there was no single team owning it and able to change it. It affected like 6 to 15 teams. And the QA team who was closest to the deploy process also didn't really know. They did a lot of things because it made sense for their perspective. Like if you put a QA team at the end of everything, then what are they doing to make sure that there's quality? Adding a lot of end-to-end tests. It's the only thing you can do at that point. Doesn't make sense, but it's the only thing they can do to ensure that they don't ship something that is broken. So the challenges were plenty. And first of all, this huge deployment monolith, like huge, relatively huge, owned by 6 to 15 teams, was something we couldn't that easily change. And also in many regards, it had a lot of benefits. So we were not kind of ready in going down the entire microservice route and just creating a lot of services, because like the thing worked well, it scaled well, the deployments actually could work fine, and we thought there is something different. But what was a real problem was this blocking downstream QA team. So we kind of in our industry accepted that we don't put the operations team in charge of operating our deployments and our systems, because we don't want the blocking dependency to the QA to the operations team. So that's where DevOps came from and so on. But in our case, we did the same mistake with the QA team. Not better. And the dev teams were completely disconnected from the deployments. They didn't know what's going on there. They didn't know what it means. And they also sometimes did huge and messy changes that went live with a single deployment, just super risky. So it was not good, but nobody had an idea how the process looked like, and nobody was owning that process, right? So, and the lack of awareness of all the issues and the challenges was really a big issue, also because there was a lot of confusion, like why does it take so long to deploy that? It cannot be that hard. But the process was painfully slow. And also the dev teams didn't really know like about the end-to-end tests, about, for example, manual steps that were part of the deploy process, like a change log and so on. So that was our situation. Of course, there are solutions, and I want to get to those because those are the interesting part. And they might actually be different from what you might think, because it's not so technical actually, but we will get also a bit to the techniques. First, when I started this journey, for me it was clear this is not something we can fix overnight, because there is a lot of mindset changes that need to happen, a lot of learning, a lot of experience. We need to help people understand how the deploy process looks like and so on. So first of all, we need to make sure that we can go on a journey that might take us maybe a year. It took us a bit more than a year, but maybe a year, and people not losing interest, especially like the business not losing interest in us investing time in this. So we needed an exciting vision that was easy to understand for people and for people to get excited about. Why are we doing this? And for a vision, it needs to be emotional and needs to be rational. People need to feel that this is something amazing, and they need to understand by numbers that this is amazing. For example, 3 people spend 1 or 1.5 days a week on doing deployments. You can calculate the numbers for that. It's very expensive. Then, when you have the vision, you find supporters. In our case, in the company, because of the growth, me, together with some 2 colleagues, actually, we started a tech leadership community, having a tech lead from every team to exchange ideas, talk about like cross-team stuff. And those tech leads were ideal supporters, because when we convinced them, they could bring the idea of, hey, let's do continuous deployments. We can get there. This will be amazing. They could bring that into the teams. Also, our VP of engineering kind of trusted me, but also thought continuous deployments are great. So they were also a great sponsor for the idea and said, yeah, it's okay that we invest time in that, because this will give us a competitive edge. So that helped, and then we could convince also like the C-level and so on, because in the end, people need to spend time on making this happen. It doesn't happen automatically. Now, okay, we have supporters, we have a vision. That's not enough, because just because people like the change to happen, it doesn't make it happen. And we needed people to make it happen. For us, because the company grew and we had this like big shared deployment monolith, it was kind of obvious that a platform team here could help us. In our case, it was the platform and developer experience team, a dedicated developer experience team that I started by hiring some people from different teams in our company. And the continuous deployments became one of our main goals. Because, yeah, that was kind of a big leverage for the entire teams. But also we got a lot of other tasks, because everybody was using the same build tools, the same pipelines. So if one of those sucked, then it sucked for everybody. And if we could solve that, they liked us immediately. So this was the idea: reduce the pain for the engineers, reduce the cognitive load, without becoming a new bottleneck, without becoming a new dependency for them. So we would not just take the deploy process and do it for them, like deployments as a service, trademark registered. No, we would do it something different. We would basically make pipelines simpler, add more build nodes, make it faster, more stable, give them templates that they could create their own pipelines, for example, if they have a new front end and it's Vue.js like everybody else had in our company. 2 lines of GitLab YAML, and they got a pipeline that ran on optimized nodes, got optimized containers and everything. Super easy for them to use, but they could also make them more specific, more advanced when they had to. That's the idea of a platform team, basically. So how did we get the developers near the deployments? We did something that was really nasty, and people really didn't like us for that. We introduced a deployment rotation, which means like 6 to 15 teams that work on the same artifacts that are deployed. And normally the QA team would do the deployments, but then we said, no, let's not do that anymore. You are going to do the deployments. And we rotate that so that every week another team will do the deployments. That's fun, right? The tech leads, they liked the idea and said, yeah, that's what we should do, but the teams not so much, because it was comfortable before, right? So, but we did it anyways. We could convince them, like, with a lot of talking, and please help us with that. It's only for a short time. It will be better, we promise, to take part in that. And for that, the QA team created a list of all the steps, kind of a checklist of what they do to make a deployment happen, from automated end-to-end tests in Selenium, run from a local machine, to manual test, click here, here, and here, create a changelog, and what else? Like, a lot of stuff was in there. And then we let the teams do that. And the QA engineer would shadow them just to make sure that they feel safe. That's very important, make the people feel safe. and also make sure that they don't forget something, don't break something, and so on. So that was the idea of the deploy rotation. And then every Friday, I would sit with the team that was on deploy rotation and did a small retrospective, basically, and asked them, how was it for you? Was it fun? No? Okay, too bad. No, like to see what did they like, what was surprising, what kind of questions did they have, what kind of problems were there, what did they learn also about, like, you should not change things that are not backward compatible, because then you see a lot of errors in the logs and you panic when you're on deploy rotation. You need to figure out what's going on. So they learned also how to do safe changes through that. And from the results from the retrospective, the developer experience team, the QA team, and some volunteers in our company, they would just go and fix the stuff that was identified. For example, where the deployment job was flaky, okay, we debugged that, we figured out why it was flaky, we removed that. Or we don't think this end-to-end test is needed, okay, again, we removed that. Like all those things, so like small continuous improvement steps, and every time people came back to the deploy rotation, the deployments looked different, simpler, faster, nicer, up to the point where at some point the deployment rotation had a single job, and that was clicking the button in GitLab. But we will get there. So once we had this kind of changes in the organization, we just needed to simplify and automate and accelerate. So simplification, for example, means like we reassess every part of the deploy process. Why are we doing this? For example, like change logs. I don't think you should create change logs during deployments, at least not for for customers, because like what can you do? You can take the Git like history and create a changelog from that, but that's not really telling to customers. It's meant for developers, right? So we asked the question, why are we doing it like this? And we asked customer success, do you really need it like this? And they said, well, actually, no. So we said, okay, then let's not do it anymore. But what we could do instead was a rolling changelog, where engineering teams would just write down in a Notion document if they wanted a change to be like promoted to customers. For example, we introduced this amazing feature, or we fixed this nasty bug. And then once a month, the customer success team would take that and just put it on a website in a nicely written form, and customers could read it. Like, I don't think like you need semantic versioning, you don't need like change logs by deployments on software as a service, at least, or when you own like and deploy things to servers that you own yourself. That just makes things a lot more nasty than they should be. Also, it doesn't really make sense, change logs by deployments, because, and we will get there, when we decouple deployments and releases, the deployment doesn't really promote the change to customers, maybe to a small group, but the release does. So customers would get very confused because you announce features that they don't even see. All right, we also automated a lot of things like end-to-end tests that were not automated yet, and we accelerated the pipelines, adding more workers, figuring out what the bottlenecks were, providing custom-built containers that contained all the tools so that the jobs were faster, introduced caching, in our case, Gradle Enterprise, for example, for the JVM world, now called Velocity, wherever they call it like that. But anyways, and also better end-to-end test tooling, we'll get there. And also, we improved monitoring and alerting, because one thing that you really want when you do continuous deployments is that you don't need to look into the logs, because otherwise you look into the logs all the time, because you are deploying all the time. You want your alerting tool to tell you, hey, there's something strange in the logs, have a look. And then you look, not earlier. So also that was something that we got from the deploy rotation, but also something else we had already in the company was called support rotation. Basically, that were the people who were responsible to look into certain Slack channels and see like the alerts coming in at that time for this shared system. All right. Decoupling deployment and releases, something that's really, really important, and I think a lot of people don't do, and that's what makes continuous deployments messy. When you decouple deployments and releases, you have a lot of abilities actually. Who does that? Like, who uses release toggles, feature flags, anything like that? Yeah, a couple, great. So what you really want is that you can ship things to production without activating them already for your customers. Especially when you have like multi-tenancy, like in B2B, then you also have the flexibility, depending how you implement that, to activate certain features only for certain customers, maybe internal test tenants on the production system, which allows you to test in production. And that's not crazy. It works fine and it gives you real good feedback if you do it with deployment, with release toggles and do it in a safe way. So for us, because we already use GitLab, we decided to use GitLab feature flags. That's a free feature that GitLab provides. That's basically an Unleash server, like an Unleash API that you can integrate with your system. And then your production system can ask GitLab, hey, is this activated? And then you have an if branch somewhere in your software, and that tells you, if this is activated on this tenant, I do this, otherwise I do something else. That's also nice because it brings down your mean time to recovery to a couple of seconds if you do it right. Because when you see an error, you switch on off the feature flag, the release toggle, and the error is gone, ideally. Like, not always that's possible, but if it's possible, it's really nice because you don't need to wait for another deployment to fix your issues. And then, of course, a lot of technical coaching and mentoring continuously with the teams, helping them to make smaller changes, because one thing that continuous deployments requires is continuous integration. And if you work with so many people, there happens a lot of things on different branches. And if you have branches that live longer than a couple of hours, ideally I would say minutes, then you don't do continuous integration. And then that means you learn quite late that the things you build don't work in integration with the rest of what other teams have built. So changing the mindset, understanding how we can merge small changes like behind release toggles. That's something we help teams to understand. When they had a bigger, more complex refactoring or change, we tried to collaborate with them, like team programmings, and discussed how can we make this in a safe way, what's the smallest change we can do, how can we do this incrementally. And we had a couple of cross-team programmings in the company anyways, once a week, actually, and teams brought those topics there. So that was quite nice. Then we migrated to Playwright. We tried a lot of things to make Selenium usable before. Who knows Playwright? Okay, I really love this tool. And like, if you have been to the talk from Soraya yesterday, like my fazit is like, when in doubt, use Playwright. Maybe Cypress, but actually Cypress, we also migrated away from Cypress, but Selenium was our main pain point. We tried with Selenium to make it fast by running it in parallel. Like we sent all our test suites to AWS Lambda and had like maybe 100 of Lambdas running the end-to-end test in parallel. That was kind of fast, but still not really fast enough, and Selenium was still kind of flaky. And another pain point that we had, coming from a developer experience perspective, was that our QA team wrote them in Python, and our engineers didn't like Python. They used Node.js, TypeScript, maybe some Kotlin on the JVM. So Python was a bit like, no, that's another language. I don't want that. And also no typing and all of that. So when we found out, okay, we can actually migrate to Playwright, we tried this with a couple of tests and saw they are much faster, they are stable, and we got to like write the code, the test code in a clean way. And also we got to write it with engineers to understand, is this test really needed? Like, that's also something. So that helped us a lot to get the adoption for the end-to-end test in the dev teams. And then refresh the vision. I stress this so much because this is so important, especially if you consider that the company changed quite a bit. So over 1 year, there were double as much engineers as in the beginning. So like half of them have never heard of the vision, or they forgot what it was. And I used every opportunity for that to get people excited. There was an incident. Oh, nice. Look how nice it would look if you had continuous deployments. Wouldn't it be nice if you would have had release toggles for that, so we could have fixed that within seconds? Like every opportunity I got. We also had some internal developer conferences where I gave a presentation that looked like, slides looked a bit like this, from production, from push to production in 15 minutes. later we were like down to 10, but considering this, that in the beginning we were like around 80 minutes for the entire pipeline, 15 minutes sounded ridiculous. Like nobody thought we could do this. But because we already understood what's going on and had ideas how to do this, we were quite confident we can get it down. And we explained in this talk kind of how we did this. And you see those two gears here, they mean there is manual interaction needed. And I explained then that this is where we lose a lot of time. Like the first one, merge request reviews, which we don't need if we do pair programming because we have constant reviews. Maybe we just double check in the end a merge request that we had for compliance reasons, but we merge it within a minute maybe. And the other one was, of course, the manual deploy process, the thing where hours were wasted. That's why also the bold is there, because this is where it got really annoying for people on the deploy rotation. And then I showed the future. That was at that time maybe 2 months from now, where everything is much more compressed by parallelizing things, and also those manual interactions were gone with the continuous deployments. And this was a later slide on another internal event where I just showed a bit of the timeline, what we are planning to do, what we already did, so that people could understand this is not fiction, it's actually possible. And maybe they know what they are doing, and we can really trust that this will be amazing. So that was the idea behind that. But still, we had some pushbacks. And I think pushbacks are normal if you do like a transformation like this over that time, because well, we are humans and sometimes we are scared by change. We might even not understand why it's necessary, why it helps us. And the first pushback, maybe you have heard that before. Continuous deployments won't work here. Who have heard something like that before? Yeah, nice. When you hear something like that, what the person is saying is, I don't know how it could work. So if you rephrase that in your mind, that makes it a lot more approachable, because then we can work with that. We can discuss, okay, why do you think it won't work? What do you see what I don't see? Maybe what do I see what you don't see? And I mean, at that time, I got it. Like when people like think of the deployment process like this fire that I showed at the beginning, when people see that and think this is deployments, doing that continuously sounds really awful, because it sounds like a lot of pain, and the deployment process is slow, complex, flaky, mystical, like everything you don't want. And doing that continuously is not like an attractive idea. Especially if you have never done this, you don't know that this might be amazing actually, because, well, if you do it more often, it's maybe less painful. And not everybody had like this clear path that we saw, because like, well, it was our job to work on that all day. Kind of like we did other things, that's why it took so long, but we had this idea what's possible and what's not. We were more in the details in the tech and so on. And so not everybody thought this is possible, and they only saw things are slow and flaky and so on. So it was normal that we had pushbacks there like this. And now you have two options. You could try to convince people and tell them, no, believe me, it's really great. We do it and you will see it. But then people might get scared, they might push back, and in the end, we had no authority over the other teams. We could not force them to do anything they didn't like. We really need to get their buy-in. But for continuous deployments, the nice thing is you can do a lot of changes in that direction continuously. Like you can reduce build pipeline, like lead times of the pipeline. Nobody will object that, because that's better anyways. You can remove things that were manual before. You can remove the pain with the end-to-end test. You can introduce feature toggles. All of that is nice. It makes things easier. And it makes the entire process faster and easier and more stable, up to the point where people think, oh, actually it could work here, because now it's just like at the end, like the deploy rotation was clicking a button. And people were asking then also, why do we need to do that? Can that not be automatic? Yes, of course, that was the point. But yeah, I told this already, a lot of pushback about the deploy rotation. And that was, well, kind of, yeah, obvious, because then dev teams who did that, they spent 1.5, sometimes 2 days a week on doing the deployment. So they got much less done of their usual work. But when we reminded them, like our people were really kind people, and when we reminded them that the QA team was doing this for over a year, every week, they had a bit of empathy and thought, oh yeah, that was not so nice of us to let them do that. So they got more open to do that. And people didn't want to own the end-to-end tests. Made also sense because they were in Python, they were not written by them, they were testing things they didn't want to test on that level. So we reminded them that ownership also means they could remove them. Because in the end, there is no, like, end-to-end tests are the worst tests of all because they take the longest, are most expensive, and you get the feedback the latest. They are also the greatest test of all because they get as close to the customer perspective as you probably could. But if you have good unit tests and integration tests, for some teams it might mean there is not much we need to test on an end-to-end test level. So it's all about giving the team confidence that their changes don't break anything and work well. And if they can get that without end-to-end tests, they are just a tool. There is no like police that says you need to have at least 5 end-to-end tests, otherwise you are not allowed to deploy. No, like discuss this with the QA expert. That's why we have a QA team. They can like consult you on this. You can make a decision what you think is best. And so a lot of teams ended up removing a lot of their end-to-end tests, but some created also more end-to-end tests. Every team did what worked best for them, and the results were actually quite convincing. Getting to that later. This was really nice. Deploying on Fridays is madness, which is kind of common sense, or I think nonsense in our industry, that we should not deploy on Fridays. I think not deploying on Fridays is super harmful, because basically what you are doing is you are batching all the changes from Friday and deploy them on Monday when nobody remembers what you did on Friday because you had fun on the weekend, a couple of beers and whatnot. And then you deploy them on Monday and hope that the person who did the changes is still there and not on vacation or not sick or something, and so on. Also, if you batch deployments, changes into one deployment, and something goes wrong, you need to figure out which of the 50 changes that we did actually broke something. If it's just one change, it's super obvious. So there was kind of a pushback when we suggested to turn on continuous deployments finally every day. And again, we didn't force people because we wanted them to feel safe. So we agreed to do like fake continuous deployments, like Monday to Thursday, but not on the weekends. And then 3 weeks later, somebody wrote me on Slack a bit of annoyed, like, do you know why our changes are not deployed? Yes, of course I know. It's Friday. Like, it took only 3 weeks for people who were skeptical about doing continuous deployments like every day to realize this is nice, this works, we don't think about it, it just happens and it's there and it's great. So this happened again, and I think after 4 to 5 weeks, they urged us to turn on continuous deployments as they were meant to be, like also on Fridays. And since that day, it's happening like this. So we are getting to the results. Continuous deployments every day. Whenever there are 2 people who agree that something should be deployed, then it's deployed. Like one person doing a change, one person approving the merge request, boom, 10 minutes later, it's live unless the pipeline disagrees. And even on Sundays, because why should you work on Sundays if there's not something urgent that you need to deploy on Sundays? Like now, this actually I think never happened in our company, but if 2 people thought there is something super urgent because maybe there's a bug or so, especially then we want continuous deployments. Like we don't want to have these exceptions and so on, and that gave us a lot of freedom. And also, not to forget, if you have a critical change and you are not sure, might it work, might it not work, maybe you don't push it to the main branch or like merge it to the main branch like last thing Friday afternoon before you go off for vacation, but maybe you think, okay, I keep that back for next week and we talk about it and I merge it on Monday. Also fine, but why should everybody else not be allowed to deploy just because of that? Because like fixing a typo is probably not going to break something. And also like the database refactorings we did usually didn't break things. The pipeline lead time went down from, like, I think we were at 80 to 90 minutes in the beginning, the automated time plus the manual time, to roughly 10 minutes, fully automated. I mean, of course, we had still the merge request reviews that, depending on the team, took a bit. But that really changed a lot, because then you can do those changes that usually take you weeks within half an hour or so. That's really nice. And the deployments became a non-event. They happened all the time. People kind of not really forgot about them, but then people also still were like excited that we could now do this. But it was something that just happened. And when it didn't happen, something felt wrong. Like we saw when we didn't deploy on Fridays, people were confused, like, hey, something is broken. No, it's Friday. And dev teams had more confidence in their ability to do small changes in the pipelines, in the deployments. So overall, it was really nice. And the dev teams, of course, moved much faster because, less time spent on deployments, actually no time spent on deployments, faster pipelines, faster feedback, being able to ship an experiment on Friday evening and get the results on Monday to inform the next product increment. Super beautiful. Who has heard of the DORA metrics? Couple of people. DORA metrics, that should be no surprise, are drastically improved if you do continuous deployments right. Because like DORA metric, the first one is deployment frequency. Well, 100 times a week potentially is higher than 2 times a week. So the deployment frequency increased. I mean, it was not always 100 times, but depending on how many people worked, how much changes, how small the changes. But like, I think the maximum I saw was 20 times a day. So that's higher than 2 times a week. So the deployment frequency improved. Lead time for changes is another of those 4 DORA metrics. Well, when a commit needs only a couple of minutes instead of hours to be deployed, also that improved. Change failure rate is something that people sometimes think, but that could get worse, right? Because like when you deploy much more often, no, actually it's simple math. Change failure rate means how many of your deployments cause an incident, basically. How many like changes to your production system cause an incident. Now, let's assume we do 100 changes a week, and like one of them is broken. If I do 2 deployments a week, that means 50% of my deployments cause an incident. Like simple math. So 50% change failure rate. If I do 100 deployments a week and do 100 deployments for one for every change, my change failure rate is 1%. So improved. And in the meantime to recover, the last of the 4 means how long does it take us to recover from an incident. And this also was drastically improved. First, because the release toggles, they allowed us to switch off like something that misbehaved usually within seconds. So we saw an error, we thought, oh, that was the last change. There's the feature flag, the release toggle. We turned it off, the logs were fine again, and we had time to like go for lunch, fix the bug, do another deployment, easy. Also, in cases where that wasn't possible, we could like do another deployment within a couple of minutes, so we could fix forward. So that was that. And for us, also most important, like even more important than the DORA metrics, like we are the developer experience team, the developer experience was also better. People were really happy about that. Of course, also because we introduced some pain with the deployment rotation, but that's not the point. It was great. And most engineers to that point never had experience that this is possible, and they were surprised how amazing it is. The QA team kind of changed a lot how they work, because they were not the blocking downstream dependency, busy all the time doing and fixing deployments, but they were now actually able to consult teams as an enabling team. Hey, you work on a new feature. Let's talk how we can make this have quality. Like, what's the right test on which level? What are you maybe missing? Have you thought of this edge case? So they had time for that, and they also had time to explore other tools, for example, for performance testing, which they didn't have time before. And customers loved it. This is like where we close the loop to the customers. I mean, customers honestly don't care about your deployments. They just care about getting their changes fast. They care about bugs being fixed fast and so on. But something that really happened was that we deployed something, and let's be honest, also with continuous deployments, you might deploy something that breaks something in production. That's not the point. You cannot prevent that. But the way how you react is different. So we saw that. We saw it already in the alerts coming in, and we thought, okay, that was this change. Okay, let's fix it forward. And in 10 to 15 minutes, the change is live. In the meantime, a customer discovered the feature wasn't working, and they told the customer success manager. The customer success manager told us, and we said, yeah, no worries, it's fixed in 5 minutes. The change is already in the pipeline. They told the customer, no worries, it's fixed in 5 minutes, and the customer was like, what? Like, that's not what you expect from a SaaS company, to fix the bugs within 5 minutes when you have them. So they even loved the incidents because they saw how fast we were able to fix that. And also smaller changes, like when we saw, yeah, justified idea, we should do this, let's do it. We could ship that really fast. So it was also good for the customer relation. So the takeaways, and we are coming to the end. Continuous deployments are great for the business. Like, takeaways probably for everybody. I mean, this was our journey, but I assume you work with technology, and probably more certain you are working with humans. So I think the takeaways are also for you. So it's great for the business because it creates a win-win-win scenario for your customer, for your employees, and for your business if you do it right. And also, something that I think is really important is continuous deployments enforce healthy constraints. How you build things. Like, you cannot say, yeah, we will fix that later, or we will test that later. It's the biggest lie ever. You will never do this, because once it's in production, the next thing is more urgent. But with continuous deployments, there is no later. Like, later is live. And if you are not confident that you won't break things, better not postpone it to later. So you have this healthy constraint of do the right things, do zero downtime deployments, think about migration paths in a proper way. And that leads to higher software quality and stability, because you only can do this, like deployments so often, when you know how to do this without downtimes, without the incidents and so on. The thing is, the easier it is, the easier the earlier you start. And this is what I think many companies get wrong, like especially startups. They start somehow. They start without a pipeline. They do this manually from the local machine and so on. Then maybe they do a bit of this and a bit of that. But then they have these, like in our case, 6 to 15 teams who still are like bound to the processes from the early days. And that makes it much more difficult. Like for us, it took like roughly a year from we founded the developer experience team and we made our kind of mission to get to continuous deployments for the organization. But if you do it on day one, like when I set up a new project, I set up a continuous deployment pipeline, and that's there, and that defines how I build the product, how we build the software. And I do this also with smaller startups, and usually then the change is done within a week or so. So the earlier you start, the easier it is. Again, have an exciting vision, but start small. Like, it can be very scary when you just say, hey, we do continuous deployments. Then you might lose people already there because they say it don't work, it's insane, you don't know what you're talking about. But you can do small increments like you would do with continuous deployments and kind of deploy the process change also continuously. Tech is not the difficult part because we all are great engineers, and no matter in what kind of technology you work, somebody probably has solved continuous deployments there from the technical aspect. So there are tutorials, you can Google, you can talk to other people. You can also come later and talk to me. I'm happy to talk about this topic if you haven't noticed. And we can sort out the technical stuff very easy, but the difficult thing are the people. Because people react in very unforeseeable ways, and it takes a long time to get them with you. So, and that brings me to the next point. Like, you need to over-communicate. Like, when you think you communicate, I really thought I communicated too much, what we are going to do, why we are going to do this, what's next, and so on, how people should do deployments, how people should do changes, just to find out that people didn't know. People didn't read it in Slack, people didn't listen to what I told, people misunderstood that. That's very normal, that's human communication. Like, if you know Vio's law, communication usually fails except by accident. That's kind of true, and that means you need to communicate much more than you normally would on different ways, different occasions, in one-on-ones, in pair programmings, in conferences, and so on. And chances are that when you think, now I told this way too often, you told it exactly right, and most people might have gotten what you wanted to communicate. Or maybe I just stuck at communication, that could also be, but I think more communication usually is better. And again, find supporters and sponsors that like allow you to spend time on that like communicate for you, that help to convince people who are more skeptical, and so on. So for us, the VP of engineering in the tech leadership community were kind of the important supporters for that journey that allowed us to keep focus on that. And yeah, the process is still in place. I'm not with the company anymore because I'm now like a consultant full-time. But they still do it like this and they still like it, and I'm very happy. Which brings me to some closing words. First of all, books. As I saw only a few hands when I told about the Dora metrics, read the book Accelerate. I think they are explained in greater detail. Also, it gives you the science behind building and scaling high-performing technology organizations. That's already a bit older, but in general, like if you see something by Nicole Forsgren, that's always great to read. I think there are a lot of things, and also Jess Hammond and Jean Kim, they are really great people who know a lot about those topics, and they give you also a lot of science behind that. So it's not like just, yeah, just believe me, it's better. No, they have science that deploying more often actually makes companies more successful. Then we have Release It, design and deploy production-ready software. And that's basically about like circuit breakers and all kinds of stuff, zero downtime deployments, migration paths, everything you need to like make this safe. And then we have Switch, which is not a technical book at all. How to change things when change is hard. And this is about how we can take people with us on the journey, how we can get people to feel the change emotionally and rationally and to buy into it. So when you want to drive any kind of change in the organization, maybe continuous deployments, maybe something different, this is the book for you. Before I say some closing words about me, I would like to ask you, please please give me some feedback. It's just a very small form. Everything is optional, only the rating is not, because that's the point of the form. I don't need your name, I don't need anything else, but you are free to give it to me. I don't ask for an email because you cannot sign up to my newsletter via this. It's really just for feedback. You find at the end a link to my LinkedIn. Very happy if you connect with me. Also connect with me here. I'm more like the shy introvert, so that's why I'm talking here, because then maybe people come to me and I do not need to go to them. So that's my life hack. And also there's a link to the slides in case you want to get them after the feedback form. About me, I'm still Toby. I've helped software companies build better software products faster. I do this in many ways, for example, tech and leadership consulting, technical agile coaching, also interim engineering leadership, and workshops, courses, mentoring, the usual stuff. And before I open it up for question, I want you to take with you one question, and that's, what is your first step towards continuous deployments you take on Monday? Thank you very much.